Hey there, everybody. Thank you for tuning in and listening to my Lava Lab workshop. This is a workshop on React, and it's meant to be an introduction for people that have never used the framework before, or maybe have some front-end experience and just want to dive deeper into the library. So again, this is my Intro to React workshop, part of Lava Lab's Lava Learn curriculum. So first off, just a little bit about me. I'm Willie. I graduated from USC just pretty recently in May. I majored in computer science and business administration with a minor in digital entrepreneurship. I was a part of Lava Lab's fall 2016 curriculum as a developer, and now I'm currently at Coinbase as a full-time software engineer doing front-end work in React. So first off, what is React? Well, React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. It's really popular, and one of the reasons why is because it's modern, modular, and fast. It's a relatively unopinionated library, so that makes it pretty dynamic with regards to how people use it. And the core concept behind React is people can define these reusable UI components that manage state efficiently. And behind the scenes, React does some really cool browser magic to make sure that apps are fast and responsive. Like I said, React is a very popular library, has over 150,000 GitHub stars, 8 million weekly NPM downloads, and it's super well maintained and used by tons of companies. In fact, it was actually created by Facebook and is one of the largest open source projects out there on GitHub. So again, like I said, React is a very popular library used by a ton of companies. There's tons of jobs out there. And what the graph on the right is saying is that developers who have used React would love to use it again. So this just speaks more to React's popularity, its support, and the positive developer experience that comes with using it. So if you want to build a web interface, React is a very good candidate. So now that I've just hyped up React, let me just get into the goals of this workshop. Simply put, my goal is that after this workshop, you'll have a better understanding of what React is and what it's capable of, JSX and ES6 syntax, components, some of the fundamentals behind them, and lastly, how to use hooks to manage data and breathe life into your React app. So before I dive deeper into this workshop, I want to call out the repo associated with this workshop, which has a README and a completed sample project. We'll dive deeper into the sample project later in this workshop, and if you ever get lost, the README will hopefully be there to help you catch up. One thing to note is that this workshop has 3 parts. The first part, which I'm doing right now, is a dive into some React concepts. Second is a live coding demo that displays some of those concepts. Lastly, we'll be doing a dive into a bit more complex applications so you can understand how things fit together. Now there are some prerequisites to this workshop, so in order to follow along, make sure you've installed Node.js and NPM. The links are in the README for your respective operating systems, and of course make sure that the versions are up to date. In addition, because this is an introduction into a front-end library, make sure you have a little bit of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript experience. If you don't, you might be able to follow along, but you might fall behind. So again, just make sure that you understand some of those concepts before you dive further into React. All right, so now the introductory stuff is out of the way. Let's get to it. Let's do a bit of a deep dive into some key React concepts. So one thing you need to understand about React is that it uses JSX, which is a syntax extension of JavaScript that introduces some XML-like syntax alongside JavaScript. And it looks kind of funky and weird, but hopefully as you start to use React, you'll get a little bit more comfortable with it and understand how things fit together. So this slide here shows an example of JSX. At the very bottom, you can see there's some HTML mixed in with JavaScript. It looks and feels funky, but you'll get used to it as you start to do React development. And at the top of this code snippet, you'll see some import, export, some interesting syntax that I'm using. I'll do a bit of a quick dive into some of the ES6 syntax that React uses. We'll be writing code in ES6, which is an updated version of JavaScript with some cool syntactical and functional upgrades. For example, on this slide on the left, this is how you can export and import code, so you can split up JavaScript across different files. On the right, this is an alternative way of writing functions. You can kind of define a function as if it was a variable and use it that way. On the next slide, we introduce this concept of destructuring. I'll let you kind of scan them and understand it. It's a really cool way to read variables and stuff like that. And lastly, on the right, this is a thing called template literals. It's a very easy way to embed JavaScript values into a string. I won't go too deeply into this ES6 stuff, but you can do some reading on it, but you'll start to see some cool stuff as you progress through your React journey. So now we're on to the heart of what React is made of, and React is made of components. Components are independent, reusable pieces of interfaces that can be made up of other components. On the right is an example of an interface and how you might split it up into different components. So for example, you have this main component, which might have a menu component made up of different categories. On the right, for example, you might have these list items components within a larger list component. You might have these granular button components. So basically, I'm hoping what you can recognize here is that components, have a relationship with each other, and you can kind of break it down into a tree-like format. And so components, they independently control how they and their children behave. So you can have data and functions passed into them, and they can also manage their own internal data or state. If this doesn't make that much sense to you, hopefully it will as we dive into some code and more diagrams and explanations. Components in a React app make up a component tree. So at the root, you have one main app React component, and that React app component will have a bunch of other smaller components that make up the interface and control a bunch of different things for the application. So in the example of a contacts application, here we have one main contacts component, which has a bunch of different components for dealing with certain things like the add contact side, a contact list, a search bar, and those components themselves might have some other smaller components, with their own specific use cases. One thing to know here is that data flows in one direction, and that's from parent to child. So if contact card wants access to, some contacts, that grandparent component will need to pass it down to contact list, which will pass it down to contact card. In addition, let's say that we want add contact form to update that list of contacts. We would need to pass down an update function from contacts to add contact form. Now that I've explained what components are at a high level, let's actually look at some code. So one thing to note is that components are just functions that take in props or data. I'll dive into that just a little bit more later. And simply the component on the left, what it does, it takes one piece of data, which is a message, and it displays a error message, a message that is rendered as HTML. So this is a component that can be used by other components. So on the right, this is a parent component that uses that error component on the left, as you can see in the highlight. So what this is basically doing is using that error component to show a message when an error occurs. Now that you've seen what components are at a high level and you see some code, let me explain some key concepts with regards to components. Components can accept props, and props or properties are basically immutable configurations. So what this is saying is I can pass in variables or a function into a component, and that component can use that function or consume that data, but it can't change it. What components can change is something that's called state. And state is internally used within a component, and a component can pass in that state to its children. Components can also have internal methods for modifying state, doing calculations, fetching data, and more. This can be used by the component during its life cycle. Lastly, components typically return markup, which can be a mix of HTML and other React components. Some of those concepts are hard to understand if you're not looking at code, so let me just show you. This is a number component. What its expected behavior is that it will show a number with a label, and it will have a button that when you click it, it will update that number and add one to it. So first off, the first arrow is pointing at a prop. It takes in a label prop that is passed in from a parent component. The second thing is that we're declaring a state variable called amount, and we're defaulting it to 0. The third arrow is calling out an internal method that we'll use to handle click events, and this will mutate our state by updating our amount variable by 1. The fourth arrow is calling out what this component will look like when it's rendered, and so it'll actually embed some of those variables into the HTML. And we also are attaching the handle click method to our button so that whenever it's clicked, that internal method gets called. That last arrow is calling out how a parent component might use this number component and pass in a label prop. Hopefully this clears up a little bit as to some of the stuff I was calling out earlier, and if it doesn't, we'll be diving a little bit more into this through some live coding. One last thing about components is to understand that there's a life cycle to them. So they kind of go through 3 stages during a component's life. One is mounting. This is when the component first shows up. It'll mount itself onto the DOM and do some setup and initialization work. Throughout the component's life, props may change, state may change, and so when the component detects certain changes, it'll update itself accordingly. It might re-render or call off a certain method, things of that nature. And lastly, when a component is no longer needed, it will unmount itself and do some cleanup work when it's removed from the DOM. So this might not be super interesting or important to you right now, but it's something to keep in mind as you start to progress as a React developer. So thank you for bearing with me. I just explained React components, and now I'm going to start diving into some of the technical implementation details. So I'm actually teaching you how to use React using functional components with hooks. We'll be using hooks to manage state and hook into the React component lifecycle. Now, hooks are a recent introduction into the React ecosystem. They were introduced in 2018, but they're now being adopted as the new standard of React development. If you've ever done React development before and you're used to class-based components, this might be a little confusing, but hopefully things will clear up when we move to the live coding and deep dive part of this workshop. You actually saw some hooks earlier when I was showing you some code for different components. So just to call out some of the main hooks we'll be using, first is useState. This lets us define a stateful variable and a method for updating that variable. UseEffect, this is an extremely useful hook, and this basically lets us define behavior for when a variable changes. Another thing is something called useCallback. This is a hook for defining callback functions that should update when certain variables change. And then lastly, there's something called useMemo, which is basically us telling our React component to recalculate something when a certain variable changes. So I know it's hard to understand these concepts without seeing it with relation to code, so here's some code that actually uses hooks. It doesn't use all the hooks, but I'll call out some of the hooks that it uses. So first off is the useState hook, which is what the second arrow points out. We're using this to declare an amount state variable that defaults to 0, and then we get a method that lets us update that state variable. On the third arrow, we're calling out the useCallback hook, and this is basically declaring a function that will recalculate its behavior whenever amount changes. Now, you might be saying, like, why do we need to do that? Basically, in a large-scale application where we have a bunch of data that's moving around, this is actually a performance benefit, and also makes us a little bit more mindful as to how our component should react to changes. The benefits of this might not be readily apparent, especially to new React developers, but as you start to scale up a React application and build some more complex components, you'll start to see the benefits of this. Now, I know that was a lot, and seeing all those concepts without actually touching code can be kind of confusing, so let's actually start to move to the actual fun part, which is live coding. I'll walk you through how to build a React component, how to use hooks, and how this stuff all fits together, so hopefully you'll better understand a lot of the React component concept stuff I just tossed at you over the last 10 to 15 minutes. We're going to go ahead and do some live coding so you can actually see those concepts translated into actual working code. So I just opened up Terminal and I CD'd into my desktop. You should already have Node and npm installed. You'll know if they are installed if you can run these two commands and get the right versions. I believe Node, you want at least 8 something, and npm at least version 5. So if you have that working, you're good to go. So we're going to run a command line tool called npx, and we're going to call a package called create react app. And that's going to let us generate a boilerplate React app that we can work off of and build off of. So this is very good for most React apps. So if you just want to start a React project, all you have to do is write npx create react app and then the name of the folder that you want your app to be generated in. For this case, I'm just going to have it called demo, but you can call it whatever you want. So I'm going to run this command, and it's going to take a little bit to install and run and build the boilerplate. So while that's happening, I'm going to explain what we're going to build. We are going to build a simple scoreboard application where you have 2 players. They increase their score by clicking a button, and whoever reaches a score of 10 first wins. And whoever wins, there'll be a little message that will display on the screen. Pretty simple application, but there's some stuff there that I'll use to illustrate some React concepts, which hopefully, by going through this demo, you'll be able to understand React a little bit better. Of course, if you ever get lost, I'll have some details in the README, so you can keep track even if you lose track of the video. So, anyways, it's finished setting up our demo React project. So if I click it, you can see here some of the files. It also gives you some several commands here that you can run. So you'll see that there's a thing called yarn. So what you actually want to do is, if you don't have yarn installed, you can install it by running npm install -g yarn. So I would run this command if you don't have yarn installed. I already have it installed, so I'm not going to run it. But what yarn is, it's simply a alternative to npm. It has some benefits that I won't get into, but it's Facebook's preference for managing Node packages. So we're going to go ahead and use it because that's what Facebook recommends. So we're going to cd into our demo folder and run the yarn start command. What this is going to do is it's going to start a development server on localhost 3000, and if you just give it a second, it'll start running a React app on localhost 3000. So now I'm actually going to open up this demo workspace into my text editor of choice, which is VS Code, and it says edit source app.js and save to reload. So if I open up that file, I can edit it right away. So I'm actually going to delete all this HTML stuff here, so it's just an empty div, and you'll see that it'll update in real time. I can even add my own element here. Say hello world. So before we dive in some more code, let me just walk through what's in this boilerplate. So you have an app.js, which is your main app component. You can define some styles that you can import within the component. Here is index.js. This is the main entry point file. This will actually attach our React application to the HTML. So we mostly will not be touching this, or you shouldn't have to touch this. So the only file that we should really be focused on right now is app.js. And maybe some of the CSS files if you are, if you want to start styling already. But anyways, let's close out the other files and just focus on app.js for now. And I'm going to go ahead and delete some of the unnecessary lines of code. So we basically just have an empty div. So I'm going to save this. Our app's basically going to reset. So let's look at this. Right now, this is our main app component. This is the parent. This is the root of our component tree. And it doesn't take any props, doesn't have any state. All it's simply doing is rendering, what is essentially a hard-coded HTML block. So now that we're here, let's actually write a few components. So like I said, we're building a scoreboard application where we have two players. They each have a score, and we want to give each player a button that if they click will increase their score by 1. So let's go ahead and create a component. I'll call it player. So remember, components can basically just be functions, and they return what they should render. So player, for now, we'll just return a div and a paragraph that says player. Now to use this component in our app, we need to embed it like so. So we have two player components, and as you might have expected, it just simply renders player. Well, what if we want to give him like a label or a name? Well, we're going to have to pass in a prop, and we're going to give it the prop label. So I'm going to say this is player 1, and same thing here, this is going to be player 2. I'm going to save that, refresh. Nothing is happening because we're not consuming the prop in our player component. We're going to go ahead and update this component so we can actually read the value of label. So we can access this label prop off this props variable. So we can say, we can replace this with props.label. And let's also give it a header so it just looks a little bit nicer in the HTML. So any value that we pass into here, the player component will render it in an h1 tag. And as expected, it renders player 1 and player 2. So simple props there. But now let's add some state. So remember, components are independent and reusable. So we can give each player component their own individual state that only is trackable by player, the component itself, and its children. So if we had maybe another child component like number that displayed the score in a nice different way, that would be independent from any other player components in our app. Anyways, we want to add that score state, so in order to do that, we need to import the useState hook. To use it, you do something like this. You do const the name of the variable that will keep track of that state, which would be score, the name of the method that will update that state variable, we'll call it setScore, and then you call useState and you set the default value by passing in the parameter. So this could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, maybe even null, but we want the default score to be 0. So let's render that score here. Like so. So this will print out a paragraph that says score, and then we'll embed the value of score into the DOM. So we'll click save, and we should see 0 because it's defaulted to 0. And right now, there's no way for that state to update or change So we're gonna go ahead and add a button, and we're gonna give it the label of add point. If I click add point, it will do nothing. So how do we add, some logic or behavior to that? We're going to use the use callback hook. This lets us define a callback function or callback method using hooks. So we're going to call this handle click use callback. It takes two parameters. So the first one is a function, and the second is a dependency list. Now, I'll explain a dependency list in just a bit. For now, I'm just going to set the logic so that when you do click it, it's going to send an alert to the browser and say, hey, I got clicked. Simple as that. We're going to put this on the now to attach it to the button, we have to tell the HTML to call this function whenever the button gets clicked. So on click, we wanted to call the handle click function. Note the syntax here, we're wrapping it in curly brackets. So I'll save this, and now if we click the button, it'll call the alert, which is pretty cool. But that's not what we want. We want it to actually update the score. So we're going to replace this with the setScore method, and we want to update it, the score, by just simply adding 1 to it. So let's save that, and let's click add point. Well, that's weird. We're clicking it multiple times, but notice how the score stays at 1. Because we're using the use callback, what's actually happening here is that use callback looks at the dependency list and will update the logic whenever any variable in this list changes. Because there's no variables and it's just an empty list, the logic for this function will never recalculate. So handle click will always set the score to 0 plus 1. It never updates when a score updates. So we need to say in the dependency list that we want score to be dependency. So use callback will recompute the logic whenever it's called, or whenever score changes. So let's click save, and now whenever we click add point, it actually adds points as expected. So you might be asking or saying, hey, that's a little weird and like maybe a little unnecessary. Like, shouldn't it just be smart about it? Think about this when you have a really complicated and complex application where the logic might be a little bit more than just, increasing the score by 1. You might have dozens of props, dozens of state variables to keep track of. By being a little bit more verbose about the dependency list, your React components will be a little bit more performant, and it'll also force you as a programmer and developer to be a little bit more self-conscious as to the best ways to split up your application, and to be a bit more aware of what variables are changing and how your application and component should respond. So that's one of the really cool things about hooks. It does seem confusing and strange at first, but once you start to build more complex applications, you'll start to see some of the value in this. So anyways, we've gotten this far. It's cool so far, but one of the things that we wanted to do is display a message whenever a player hits a score of 10. They'll be considered the winner. Well, here's the thing. Player 1, or the player component for player 1, doesn't know the state of player 2. There's no way for these two parallel player components to know what each other's state is, because there's no shared data between them. In order for you to share functionality and data between these two components, you need to rely on the parent component to handle that, which is app. So what we're actually going to do here is we're going to define some code in the app component that will keep track of who is the winner. So let's add a state to app, and we're going to call it winner. And we're going to add a method. The method is going to be called setWinner. And for now, it's going to have a null state. There's no winner at the beginning of our when this application gets set up. Now, what we want to do is define a variable, or not a variable, sorry. We want to define a method that will actually get called by the actual player component when the score reaches 10. So I want to call this declare winner. It's also going to be a callback. And what it's going to do is we can actually give this a parameter, and we're going to say the winner label. So we're going to say set winner to the value of that parameter. So there's no way for this to be called yet, so what we're actually going to do is pass this into our player components. So you can pass in methods into components. I think that's a very important thing to call out. So it doesn't just have to be like strings or numbers. You can actually pass in methods like this and pass down logic. So cool, we have this declare winner callback. I'm also going to give it an empty dependency list. It's kind of optional at that point, but there's no dependencies that it really has to call on. So we're just going to keep it like that. So anyways, now into our player component here, we're going to use the useEffect hook. Now the useEffect hook, what it does is it will call some piece of logic whenever anything in its dependency list changes. So for an example, we'll do this for useEffect. We'll call useEffect whenever score changes. And whenever score changes, we want to simply just alert the score. So as you can see, when it got set to 0, it called the useEffect. Whenever it got updated, it called the useEffect. So this is a really good and useful hook to know. So you can call logic whenever you can write logic that is reactive to changing variables like state. Anyways, that's not what we just want to do. We don't want to have it alert whenever the score changes. What we want to do is add some logic here. So we can say if score is greater than or equal to 10, then we want to do something interesting. Remember that we passed in this declare winner prop to our player component. So we can access that and call it. So what we can do here is say props declare winner, and we'll pass back up the label that's passed into our component. So if I click save, nothing's happening. But when I hit the score of 10, you don't see anything, so we haven't written any logic to display it. But what's going to happen there is that useEffect is calling props.declareWinner, so our app's winner state just got updated because of this callback. Now let's add in a winner banner. I'm going to show you guys how to do some conditional logic in JSX. We can say if there is a winner, display the winner. Otherwise, we'll display nothing. This is a ternary operator. You might have seen it from some of your CS classes, and it's used a lot in JSX and React to do conditional logic in the render function. So now if we click save, it should behave as we expected. Player 1 is going to hit a score of 10, and they have been declared the winner. I'm actually going to be a little bit more verbose and say winner there. But hopefully now you can see kind of how this stuff is interconnected. How you can pass logic in between parents and children, how within components you can write logic, write event handlers, keep track of state, handle props. This is a very basic application, but hopefully you can see some of the building blocks that will enable you to build more complex applications. Now we will spend some time in just a bit to do a deep dive into a slightly more complex application, so you can see how this all fits together in an actual usable application. But hopefully this was enough for you to understand React and hooks at a decent enough level. Alright, as promised, we're going to be doing a deep dive into a little bit more of a complex React application. So if you clone the Lava Lab React Workshop F20 repository, you should see a folder called Currency Exchange. So Currency Exchange was actually built using npx create React app like the last demo. So here I'm going to run yarn start, and this should boot up a local host development server, which will show us our app in just a second. So here is what the app looks like. It's a currency exchange application. Presents you a few options. So if you want to convert USD, you can do that. JPY. Let's do British pounds. So let's see how much 5 British pounds are in USD, Japanese yen, British pounds, and Indian rupees. So this is the application. You can check it out and explore a little bit more. I have some basic error checking in there. But that's the application pretty much. I even added some styles for you guys so you guys don't have to worry about the look of the application. But let's do a little bit of a dive into how this actually works, behind the scenes in an architectural sense. So let's open up app.js. This again is built using npx create React app, so same kind of architecture infrastructure. Index.js is the entry point. We don't really touch it. But app.js we modify, and I'm actually introducing a library here called React Router, and I'm not going to go too much into how it works, but because the app is the root level component for our entire application, this is where typically a router would sit. So what this is basically saying is we want the home view component to show whenever the route is a slash, or in other words, a home page, basically just, there's nothing else in the URL. Or if we see /USD, /JPY, /GBP, or /INR, we give it the label of a currency, and then we want to show the convert component, which is a separate page. So let's look at the convert and home components. Also note how I've split these up into files. So we're importing the home component from the home.js file. Notice how we're exporting the home.js file, so we can import it in our app.js, and same thing for convert. But first off, let's look at this again. So if the route is a slash, we display the home component. There's nothing too interesting about the home component. It's just a simple home screen with a few links and a title tag. It doesn't have any state, doesn't have any props, or it doesn't use any props. So don't look at this too much. If you want to look at the link component a little bit more, feel free to do so. But there's nothing super interesting or new in this home component. What does get interesting is our convert component, which will display whenever the router is on /USD, /JPY, etc. So here we have a bit more. This is a bit more complicated than some of the stuff that we've previously seen, but it still stays true to a lot of the stuff I was teaching earlier. So without looking at this, I'll explain what this is in just a bit. See here, we're still keeping track of states using the useState hook. So we have a hook that keeps track of the rates state. What we're going to do is that we're going to hit this external API from exchangeratesAPI.io. We're going to store this in a rates object and use that to do some calculations. This is amount input. This will keep track of an amount inputted in a text box. This is the results. So whenever we click the convert button, we'll do computations and store in results. And then error. This is a true or false. If it's true, we'll show an error message. If it's false, we won't. So now this is where things get interesting. Here is a use effect. Reminder that use effect gets called whenever a variable in the dependency list changes. We have this set to run this whenever currency changes. So let's actually see what currency comes from. Currency comes from a hook that lets us grab the parameter from the URL. Remember how in our router we had this currency label? This essentially translates into this. So if we actually name this ASD, I don't know, just something random, we'd also grab it like this. But it makes more sense to keep it as currency, so I'll leave it at that. So currency doesn't change, or it shouldn't change, so this should only run once. And essentially what we're doing here is actually fetching data from an API. This is something new. And notice here that we're doing this async await pattern, which is definitely, this might be new to you. Basically what we're saying here is, when we make a network request, it's not immediate. We have to wait a little bit for our browser to actually make the request. And so, this, if you ever took CS 201, you know that this can introduce some race conditions, etc. So what we're basically telling our browser is we want to run this code in a synchronous way. So we don't want to run any of this code until we finally got back the response from this request. So that's just simply what this is doing. And we wrap it in this async function to let the browser know this is an asynchronous operation. Anyways, we make a request to the API. We put the currency in as a parameter. This is a string interpolation. Notice here if I change this to JPY, it will give the, it'll change the conversion rates based on the different base. So that's simply what we're doing here. If the request is okay, in other words, it's a valid request, we'll read that JSON data and save the rates in a state object. Cool. So again, let's go back to this other state, which is amount input. This is the amount that this is a state that keeps track of the input that we're putting into this text box. So if we actually look at what calls handle input change is being called by another component called input header. Input header takes some functions as props, and it has an input HTML box. And simply what we're saying here is that whenever we detect a change in that text box, we call the handle input change method, and the value of this text box should be in line with that input state. So here, basically input header is, this lets us keep track of the amount that is inputted via a state variable. Sorry if that was a little confusing. Hopefully if you dive a little bit more further and just play around with it, you can kind of pick up on that. Lastly, we pass in a calculate results callback that will actually do some of the math and calculate the actual conversion results. So again, remember, we store the results of the conversions into a state. And so what we're doing here is we read the input. If it's not a valid number, we set the error to true, so it will display an error message. Otherwise, we take the rates that is stored and do the math, essentially, and store that in a results object that is also another state variable. Lastly, we also reset the state. So if there was a previous error, we reset it back to false, because once we've reached this path in the code, we know that we have a valid input and that we're able to calculate the actual currency conversion. So that's this convert component at a high level. If you actually look at what gets rendered, again, we have an input header component. This renders the title, the input box, and that convert button. We have an error message. So this is kind of a JSX, not a hack, but a little thing you can do that will only display this error component if error is a valid, if it's true. Here is another thing you can also do. This is basically saying, do we have results? Is it null? If it's not and we actually have results, let's display it and pass it to the results component. Otherwise, we don't display anything. And here, of course, here we just have a link component that will, once you click, it'll go back home. Now let's actually look at this results component so you can actually see how we convert this object into this. So I'm going to go ahead and click into the results component. I'm going to split my screen so you can kind of see this a little bit better. So this is the shape of our results object, and we're going to pass this in as a state, as a prop into results. Here in the results component, this is the results component. What we do is we read the results, and then we have a reusable component that we call results cell, and we just simply change the parameters or the props and display the right and appropriate currency format and a label. Again, like this component right here is pretty much identical. The only thing that changes is the actual content. So that's a pretty good use case for a reusable component like results cell. If you're wondering where this is defined, it's actually defined in the same file, and it's a pretty dumb component. When I mean dumb, I mean it's stateless. It simply just takes in data and outputs it. So that's how we're able to render all this stuff from beginning to end. If you play around with it a little bit more, hopefully things will kind of click and you can make a lot more sense of how this all kind of fits together. If you're kind of curious and just want to see some of the CSS, it's also set there. I have it set up so results.js imports results CSS, and I think you can follow the logic there. But that's the high-level overview of how this application works. And if you were able to understand some of the hook stuff that I was explaining earlier, I'm pretty confident that you'll be able to comb through this and understand it a lot further, and maybe modify it modify and add some cool features to it. So with that being said, I do have a few challenges for you that I think you should try to do to make sure that you completely understand how to use React. One thing is, on the convert screen, add a maximum and or minimum input check when a user inputs a number. So right now a user can input a pretty large number or a really small number, and maybe in a ideal world we'd only want them to input numbers greater than 5 and less than 1,000. Just an arbitrary example, right? I challenge you to figure out the best place to have that logic. I'll give you a hint. I think this handle input change is a pretty decent place for that. Or actually, calculate results is probably the better one, because this is where we actually do the error checking. So that's a hint for you. Another thing too is adding more support for more currencies. So we use this API, and it supports a bunch of other API currencies. So right now we just hard-coded USD, JPY, GBP, and INR, but there's a bunch of other currencies that you can definitely expand this application to use. So I challenge you to maybe add a couple more currencies, or figure out a way to programmatically use all of them, if that seems like a good enough challenge to you. I will say one quick caveat, by the way, is that euros, if you do put in EUR, just note that I think EUR disappears in this selection. So unlike USD will actually show up there as one, but because this is a European API, for some reason EUR disappears. So just make sure you keep track of that. That might lead to a gotcha if you're not careful. That's just something I discovered when I was playing around with this API. Another thing you can also do is, this one is a little bit more nuanced. You might have some trouble, but I think you'll also be able to figure it out. Instead of doing the conversions whenever you click convert, maybe do it so that it does it anytime this changes. So you can have like real-time conversions being done, and just remove the need for this convert button. Get another hint, maybe use effect is a good use effect is likely a good candidate to use here, because again, use effect will run logic anytime a dependency variable changes. Another thing too, you could also modify results cell, which is this component, so you can maybe add a few more fields like country. And lastly, this is a bit more challenging and a bit harder, but we have a home page and a convert page. What if we had simply just another page called rates? It's not going to show up anything, but what if you had another page called rates that displays all these conversion rates in a similar format to our results? That is going to be a little bit harder, but you can borrow a lot of the code from convert and use it in rates. Anyways, that was a bunch of challenges. I'm just kind of tossing at you to maybe stretch your understanding of React and make sure that you understand it. But I hope that you are able to understand this code base a little bit more. Again, I really recommend playing around with it, diving into it, and just trying to modify it and making it your own, because that's how I personally learned how to develop in React. I think it's a really effective way to make sure that you understand the library, etc. So with that being said, I want to thank you for listening in on this workshop. I hope that you learned a little bit about React and how it works. I'm very open to feedback, so if you have any feedback, please let me know. If you also have any questions or comments, just want to talk about React, tech, career advice, etc., don't hesitate to hit me up as well. I'm a pretty open book, and I like to make myself as helpful as I possibly can. So again, hope this was helpful. Definitely keep learning. I think React is a really awesome library, and I really recommend trying it out for your project if you plan on building some sort of web interface. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed. Thank you.